I'd like to welcome Dr. Nyla Ali Khan, the University of Oklahoma. She will be speaking on Sheikh Abdullah and his political organization, that is a national conference. But she will be speaking mainly on the early period, that is till 47. This organization was founded as a Muslim conference in 1932, and then 7 years later the name was changed to National Conference. It was a secularizing tendency within the movement. And she will be dealing with the movement against Dogra rule as well, and the impact that it has had on the politics of Kashmir. So now over to Dr. Nyla Ali Khan.
Thank you very much, Anil, and thank you for being here. I see a couple of familiar faces in the audience, which is always nice. And I think I see a couple of Kashmiri faces, which are relatively easy to identify, which is very nice as well. So my attempt is not to interpret history through the subjective lens of contemporary politics. There is a historical value in revisiting narratives about the political actors of pre-1947 Jammu and Kashmir and the movement for enfranchising the people. I begin my paper with a quote from the statement of Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah in the court of the sessions judge in Srinagar, Kashmir, during the Quit Kashmir trial in 1946. Quote, "The All India States People's Conference has clearly laid down that the old treaties between the states and the British government or its representatives are obsolete and must end. That applies to all treaties, including the Treaty of Amritsar, which has some special and unhappy features which make it a kind of sale deed of the territory and people of Kashmir. This treatment of a people as a commodity, which can be transferred for hard cash, has all along been deeply resented by the Kashmiris, whether Hindu, Sikh, or Muslim. It hurts their national dignity. In practice, the peculiar nature of the Treaty of Amritsar has led to all kinds of discrimination against Kashmiris, resulting in their treatment as some kind of lower class." End quote. The Quit Kashmir cry symbolized and gave concrete shape to this demand for the termination of a system of government which was in process of dissolution all over India. That cry had nothing personal about it. The defense counsel, Mr. Asif Ali, began his defense of the accused, Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah, with the main question, which, quote, "in this case is whether it is the right of a people to demand responsible government, even in emphatic terms, if necessary. Is it a crime to say that the basis of the government of the state should be the will of the people, and not a treaty which is 100 years old and which is impugnable in the highest international court of justice? This is the issue involved in this case, and nothing less." End quote. In an endeavor to enable the formation of representative governments in Indian states, the All India States People's Conference adopted a constitution in 1939 that underlined deploying legitimate means to help the people of the state form a responsible and representative government under the aegis of the monarch. Once the All India States People's Conference drafted and proclaimed its objectives, a number of organizations were formed in order to achieve concretization of these objectives. Prior to that, intellectually and politically drawn to the nationalist reform movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Kashmiri Pandits, for example, formed a Hindu revivalist party. In Jammu, political organizations whose hallmark was their exclusionary regionalism were formed solely for Dogras, of which the Dogra Sabha established in 1903, was the primary one. These organizations did not seek involvement just with political issues, but focused on social reform as well, particularly on improving the conditions of Hindu women. Kashmiri Muslims, led by Maulana Rasul Shah, formed the Anjuman-e-Nusratul Islam. Besides the dissemination of Islamic teachings, the Anjuman aimed at social reform and educational improvement for the Muslims of the valley. While the political mobilization of Kashmiri Muslims was still in an embryonic stage, it was pulverized by a governmental edict banning all Muslim organizations. The grievances of the Muslims were exacerbated by the labor crisis in the silk mill in Srinagar, Kashmir, which was owned by the monarch. Most of the underpaid, overworked, and shabbily treated laborers in the mill were Kashmiris. A lot of them were Muslims. These widespread exploitative practices and the resentment engendered by them impelled eminent members of the Muslim community to voice their protest in a memorandum. The memorandum was presented to the Governor-General of India, Lord Reading, in October 1924. In addition to specifying grievances, the memorandum called for an increase in Muslim employment, improved education, land reforms, protection of Muslim religious establishments from encroachment, the abolition of forced labor, equitable distribution of resources, a state constitution, and a legislative assembly that would give Muslims proper representation. When the first few Kashmiri Muslims to have obtained degrees at institutions of higher education, such as the Aligarh Muslim University in British India, returned to the state in the 1920s, they were imbued with newfangled ideas of nationalism, liberty, and democracy. Quote, "Things were now moving very fast in the Indian subcontinent. In December 1929, the Indian National Congress adopted in Lahore the resolution of complete independence as its goal. A mass civil disobedience movement followed, which electrified the subcontinent from Gilgit to Cape Comorin. Kashmir, too, felt its repercussions. People began to be deeply excited with what was taking place in the rest of the country. And when a number of Muslim young men, educated at different universities in India, and deeply moved by the Congress struggle for freedom, returned home, a spark was applied to the explosive matter which had accumulated in the valley." End quote. A group of these young graduates who were well educated but denied opportunities that would have enabled them to climb the socioeconomic ladder started convening regular meetings at a house in Fateh Kadal, Srinagar. And from these seemingly innocuous gatherings evolved the Fateh Kadal Reading Room Party. Members of the Reading Room Party wrote articles for various publications in which they expressed resentment against the arbitrary and discriminatory practices of the monarchical regime. The torch of cultural pride and political awakening in the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir was lit, among others, by Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah, a prominent member of the Fateh Kadal Reading Room Party in 1931. For the first time in decades, the Kashmiri people, particularly the Muslim population, acknowledged the leadership of a man who overtly challenged the hitherto impregnable authority of the Maharaja. They responded to his politics with a zeal that was previously unknown. Despite persecution, the Sheikh continued to vociferously fight for the political, economic, and religious rights of the Kashmiri people. Here is what Sir Muhammad Iqbal, spearhead of the Punjabi Kashmiri Muslim movement, said, quote, One thing which stands out clearly about Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah is that he has completely removed from the Muslims of Kashmir the fear of facing the Dogra army. But with your limited resources and comparatively the unlimited resources at the disposal of the monarch, you cannot continue like this for a long time. Therefore, the only way is to launch a movement in the Punjab and send volunteers from here, because the Maharaja's resources would not be sufficient to withstand such a movement for a long time. He will have to seek the assistance of the British government, and when this assistance is sought and naturally made available, then would be the appropriate moment for us to demand that if they wanted to intervene on the side of the Maharaja, then they must equally ensure that important grievances of the state Muslims were also redressed. End quote. Ahmadullah Shah, the senior Mirwais, had been unequivocally accepted by the Srinagar Muslims as their religious leader, and his authority had been ratified by the Dogra regime. When his nephew, Muhammad Yusuf Shah, assumed the leadership of the Jama Masjid in 1931, he had expected to don his uncle's mantle and exercise the same unquestioned authority. But to his surprise, his stature was undermined by a young politician of obscure origins and revolutionary political opinions, the Sheikh. The Sheikh, a political greenhorn at the time, challenged the hegemony of the Mirwais. As a strategy to eliminate the threat posed to his position by the Sheikh's rising popularity and clout, Mirwais Yusuf Shah contemptuously labeled him a heretic or a Qadiani. The Sheikh vociferously retaliated by aligning himself with Mirwais Hamadani. That political move widened the gap between the two Mirwaisin, or the two religious leaders. A few months after the formation of the Muslim Conference, Mirwais Yusuf Shah founded the Azad Conference. And in April 1933, the Sheikh's Sher followers and Mirwais Yusuf Shah's goatee-wearing Bakra followers fought a violent battle during the Eid al-Zuha prayers. But Mirwais Yusuf Shah's attitude toward the Dogra monarchy and his inclination to toe the official line made him an unappealing figure to the repressed Muslim masses. He sank further into the morass of unpopularity by accepting a stipend of rupees 600 from the Dogra regime. In the twilight of his life, Mirwais Yusuf Shah reverted to the security of his priestly edifice. Now back to 1931. In 1931, Mirza Bashiruddin Mahmud Ahmad organized the work of the All India Kashmir Committee. At a meeting between Mirza Bashiruddin and Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah, it was decided that the Sheikh would lead the movement and Chaudhry Ghulam Abbas would be the secretary. The All India Kashmir Committee comprised representatives from the Kashmir Valley, led by Maulvi Abdur Rahman, and the Jammu province, led by Allah Rakha Sagar. The duties allocated to the committee were as follows: to give financial support to the agitation, to give financial assistance to the dependents of incarcerated political leaders, martyrs, and those wounded in the firings and lathi charges, to arrange for medical treatment of the injured, to arrange legal defense for political workers, and to provide legal assistance to the preparation of cases before the Middleton and Glancy commissions. It was through Dr. Iqbal that the Glancy Commission made its report advocating religious freedom in Kashmir and emphasizing that the government could not exercise its authority at places of worship. It also mandated that education should be universal and more primary schools should be opened. It underscored the need to appoint Muslim teachers and the establishment of a special office for the administration of educational institutions for Muslims. It emphasized that jobs should be advertised and employment given to people in proportion to their population. The Maharaja's policies and unwillingness to deploy quasi-democratic measures caused the uprising of 1933, which was put down with unwarranted belligerence. Subsequently, a civil disobedience movement was organized by the Sheikh and his ally, Chaudhry Ghulam Abbas, but the Maharaja was adamant in his refusal to relent. The strident voice of the people, however, could not be drowned, and the first democratic election in the state was held in 1934. In the years prior to 1938, the rallying banner and political ideology of the Muslim Conference mobilized a collective sense of pride in regional identity. Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah and his colleagues had the political will and astuteness to create an efficiently organized network of young people who were committed to the party's ideology. The Sheikh's initial emphasis on a shared Muslim identity, which promised social and political enfranchisement, was a light at the end of the tunnel for an abject and politically disenfranchised people. The formation of secular local political organizations that espoused a nationalist and socialist ideology in the 1930s and 1940s, such as the Kashmiri Youth League, Peasants Association, Students' Federation, Silk Labor Union, Telegraph Employees Union, and so on, enabled popular political leaders to shift their focus onto the structural inequities legitimized by the state rather than on just religious and sectarian issues. Although the Muslim Conference won 14 out of 21 seats allotted to Muslim voters in the State Assembly, the Assembly had only consultative powers. 2 years later, however, fresh elections were held because the elected members of the legislature fiercely protested their restricted powers. The Sheikh's disillusionment with the supersession of nationalist aspirations by sectarian ones inspired him to forge a secular movement in the state. In order to disseminate his progressive ideas, the Sheikh and a Kashmiri Pandit, Premnath Bazaz, founded an Urdu weekly, Hamdard, in 1935. Consequently, the Muslim Conference was replaced by the All Jammu and Kashmir National Conference, presided over by Sheikh Abdullah. History has borne witness to the inability of several stalwarts to achieve their ideals because they took rigid and inflexible stands. So, in order to align itself with the purportedly secular and nationalist Indian National Congress, the younger generation of Muslim Conference leaders strove to transform a religiously oriented political movement into a movement for political, economic, and social reforms. The nature of this transformation was articulated by the Sheikh in his address to the Muslim Conference's annual session in March 1938. Quote, we desire that we should be free to set our house in order, and no foreign or internal autocratic power should interfere in our national and human birthrights. This very demand is known as responsible government. The first condition to achieve responsible government is the participation of all those people They are not the Muslims alone, nor the Hindus and the Sikhs alone, nor the untouchables or Buddhists alone, but all those who live in this state. We do not demand responsible government for 80 lakh Muslims, but all the 100% state subjects. Secondly, we must build a common national front by universal suffrage on the basis of joint electorate. End quote. In 1944, the Sheikh Abdullah-led National Conference sought reconstitution of the political, economic, and social systems of Jammu and Kashmir, and it came to be identified with socially leftist republicanism and the personality of the Sheikh. Its particular context of an indigenous political movement against the Dogra House helped evolve within this collectivity a conception of a distinct entity which had evolved its own idea of nationalism, a Kashmiri nationalism. The aim was to forge connections between the group's agenda for socioeconomic transformations with the agendas of other groups impacted by autocracy, feudalism, and communalism. Joseph Korbel, the Czech chairman of the United Nations Commission for India and Pakistan, noted the prestige accorded to the Sheikh Abdullah-led National Conference in terms of the support it enjoyed at the organizational and grassroots level. The Sheikh and his political organization fought tooth and nail against autocracy in the state and demanded that the Treaty of Amritsar be revoked and monarchical rule ousted. He described the Dogra monarchy as a microcosm of colonial brutality and the Quit Kashmir movement as a ramification of the larger Indian struggle for independence. Despite the establishment of an executive council, council of ministers, and a juridical and legislative branch of public administration in the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, the Maharaja retained his supreme authority. The Sheikh explicitly declared the anti-monarchical stance of his organization to the British cabinet mission, which was to chart the course of India's destiny, including that of the princely states. Quote, "The fate of the Kashmiri nation is in the balance, and in that hour of decision we demand our basic democratic right to send our elected representatives to the constitution-making bodies that will construct the framework of free India. We emphatically repudiate the right of the princely order to represent the people of the Indian states or their right to nominate personal representatives as our spokesmen." End quote. This well-articulated demand for the introduction of democratic measures was ignored by the administration as well as by the British cabinet mission. The Quit Kashmir movement did not bolster the Sheikh's position among the members of the Muslim Conference, and it antagonized those Hindus and Sikhs of the state who venerated the Maharaja because they owed him their political, economic, and religious privileges. In May 1946, the Sheikh was sentenced to 9 years in prison for having led the seditious Quit Kashmir movement against the Maharaja's regime. His defense against the charges leveled against him during the infamous Quit Kashmir trial was an attempt to underline a strategic syncretism enabling legitimate opposition to autocratic rule. Quote, "Where law is not based on the will of the people, it can lead to the suppression of their aspirations. Such law has no moral validity, even though it may be enforced for a while. There is a law higher than that, the law that represents the people's will and secures their well-being. And there is the tribute of the human conscience, which judges the ruler and the ruled alike by standards that do not change by the arbitrary will of the most powerful. To this law I gladly submit, and that tribunal I shall face with confidence and without fear, leaving it to history and posterity to pronounce their verdict on the claims that I and my colleagues have made, not merely on behalf of the 4 million people of Jammu and Kashmir, but also of the 93 million people of all the states of India. This claim has not been confined to a particular race or religion or color. I hold that sovereignty resides in the people. All relationships, political, social, and economic, derive authority from the collective will of the people." End quote. Despite the support that the Quit Kashmir movement, launched by the Sheikh's cadre, received from some regional councils and state congress committees, the movement was crushed tactically and militarily. On 20th May 1946, speaking at a public rally at the Shahi Masjid Mosque in Srinagar, the Sheikh thunderously condemned the 1846 Treaty of Amritsar, which had legitimized the Dogra possession of Kashmir. In a telegram sent by him to members of the British Cabinet Mission, he declared that this sale deed conferred no privileges equivalent to those claimed by states governed by treaty rights. He wished to declare that no sale deed, quote, "however sacrosanct, can condemn more than 4 million men and women to servitude of an autocrat when will to live under that rule is no longer there," end quote. As the National Conference made its support of secular principles and its affiliation with the All India National Congress more forceful, the gulf between the upholders of secularism and the guardians of an essential Muslim identity became wider. The Muslim Conference characterized itself as representing the Muslim segment of society, attempting to undermine the political dominance of the Maharaja and create a state in which primacy would be given to Islamic laws. In that environment, the National Conference found itself gasping for breath in the quagmire created by the Maharaja's policies. For example, the Maharaja's government had passed a special ordinance introducing 2 scripts, Devanagari and Persian, in Kashmir's government schools, signaling the metaphoric dislocation of Kashmiri culture. Language was seen in relation to an array of matters: political power, ethnicity, religion. So this ordinance entailed cultural and psychological denigration in Kashmiri society. And then, under the Jammu and Kashmir Arms Act of 1940, all communities except Dogra Rajputs were prohibited from owning arms and ammunition. Such communally oriented policies created a rift between the Muslim leadership of the National Conference and their Hindu colleagues. The rift within the organization was further widened by Muhammad Ali Jinnah's insistence that the Sheikh extend his support to the Muslim League and thereby disavow every principle he had fought for. His refusal to do so sharpened the awareness of the Muslim League that it would be unable to consolidate its political position without his support. Initially, the Congress supported the Quit Kashmir movement and later, for a while at least, reinforced the Sheikh's position on plebiscite. The Congress advised the Maharaja right up to 1947 to gauge the public mood and accordingly accede to either India or Pakistan. Nehru's argument that Kashmir was required to validate the secular credentials of India was a later development. Jinnah refuted the notion that Pakistan required Kashmir to vindicate its status as a dominion for the Muslims of the subcontinent. and did not make an argument for the inclusion of Kashmir in the new dominion of Pakistan right up to the eve of partition. So if Kashmir was integral to the very idea of Pakistan, it is difficult to see why the Muslim League and the Muslim Conference did not ask the Maharaja to accede to Pakistan until as late as 25th July 1947. And by then, politics in Kashmir had acquired a purposive and efficacious nature. This new politics was devoid of the narrow limitations of religion, and it created a political collectivity. I posit, and this is something that I need to do more work on, I posit that the Sheikh perceived the evolution of Kashmiri nationalism in world historical terms, as opposed to a domestic issue. He didn't subscribe to the notion that a powerful global ideology like pan-Islamism or communism or fascism would effectuate a universal liberation. He advocated the creation of a political structure in which a popular politics of mass mobilization would be merged with institutional politics of governance. The decision to accede to either India or Pakistan placed Maharaja Hari Singh in a dilemma. The Maharaja disregarded the advice of the Congress and the British about the infeasibility of independence and opted for that choice because it would allow him to maintain his political paramountcy. He was unable to recognize how independence would enhance the political and military vulnerability of the state. Maharaja Hari Singh's decision to maintain his political paramountcy, which didn't recognize the agency of his subjects, was supported by Pakistan and not by India. As opposed to that, and I conclude with this, in a recognition of human agency and mediation, and providing the rationale for the Quit Kashmir movement, the Sheikh said, quote, "No state can succeed in raising the standard of its people's life without educating and training them to pursue creative and productive activities. The percentage of literacy in the state is 6. The percentage of higher education is 1. And the average income per capita is rupees 11 per annum. This by itself is an eloquent commentary on the system and structures of government to which the slogan, Quit Kashmir, is addressed." End quote. Thank you very much.